So a lot of places in the New York metro area have announced that even if there's a winter storm, school will be able to go on just virtually. But this can't always happen. Yes, in most cases of a winter storm or any kind of inclement weather, it's not so bad to the point where you can't learn inside. But there are exceptions. Widespread power outages do unfortunately occur in some of the worst storms. In this video, I want to talk about some historical storms that can provide some context as to when you just simply can't have online school because of the situations going on. First of all, I want to make a note about Ida. Ida occurred in early September when most schools were back in session across the country, but very few across the metro area were. I'm not sure about the metro area schools, but I know for a fact that none of them closed on September 1st. Even though that was the night that all hell broke out loose, the flooding rains didn't even begin until about 5 o'clock p.m. This meant that it was safe to go to and from school. Plus, because the storm massively outperformed expectations, because it was only supposed to bring 3 to 5 inches of rain, at least out in the city, because it was only supposed to bring that little rain, they wouldn't have canceled school for that. And we're honestly lucky that more people didn't die because they got trapped. If people had significantly become trapped, this could have become the deadliest tropical cyclone weather disaster in New York history. And especially so in New Jersey history, where it came a lot closer than in New York. Like in New York, we would have had to have racked up 35 more fatalities to have tied Sandy. But even then, Sandy isn't the deadliest in history, so we would have needed 42 to tie the Long Island Express, which was the deadliest in New York history. In New Jersey, Sandy was the deadliest storm. In order to have equaled Sandy, only 7 more deaths would have been needed. That honestly could have happened. Given how bad the storm was, it's not unrealistic to assume a scenario in which 7 more people would have died. But school was not in session, and in the places where it was, the flooding rains were not an issue. Power outages were not a significant concern, but of course, flooding within homes was. On Long Island, the impacts were not nearly as bad as they were in the city, so I don't think that Long Island schools would have had a need to have called off. Most of it just seemed to have drained away. But in the city, if there was school on December 2nd, which there wasn't, then that would have caused massive problems, and some places would have had to have not been able to have school due to all the debris. That being said, the power outages from the storm were not significant enough to have warranted no virtual school that day. And in case you're wondering about the winter storms, one of them came out on a Friday and did cause a lot of school cancellations due to the general 6 to 9 inches of snow on the ground. But the one that brought 8 inches of snow in the city all the way out to 2 feet of snow on Long Island led to very few cancellations due to the storm coming in on a Friday night and delivering most of its snow on a Saturday. As such, we had Sunday to begin to clear the roads, and by Monday, while still ominous, it was safe to go to school. This is why there were a lot of delayed openings when New York City's biggest blizzard happened, because it occurred on January 23rd, 2016, which was, of course, a Saturday. Both storms would have only led to a virtual school, though, because the power outages from these storms were not that significant. Despite the loss of life and the damage caused by the snow, power grids were able to hold up. Usually, power line failure is a big concern with ice. Ice, and then these early season snowflakes when all the leaves are still on the trees. This can happen in late season winter storms too, but it's extremely uncommon at that point because trees don't usually begin to bloom until April, and by that point most of the really bad winter storms are just done with. And we don't have a lot of good historical records on any winter storms in late April. We have had one recently in early April, but that was at a time when there was still very few leaves on the trees. So So that's pretty much that. That being said, though, obviously not all weather disasters can fall on a Saturday. It's most convenient when they do fall on a Saturday, at least from a school perspective. Because, well, you know. Like, I know that on February 1st, our school did not have online schooling because there was a fear of significant power outages. On February 2nd, when it was discovered that very few power outages had occurred, the school regretted that decision and therefore decided to have virtual school. But the first day, everyone was getting really scared for the storm, and a lot of places just did not have virtual school because there was 15 inches of snow falling, so too unsafe to go to school. And a lot of people were starting to get worried that there would be significant power outages due to all the snow, especially considering that the winter had been very calm beforehand, although there was a 10-inch snowstorm that, of course, fell on a Thursday, December 17th. Flakes began falling Wednesday afternoon, but they weren't significant, and they did not cause a significant traffic jam failure that the city endured on November 15th. That caused a big problem for students getting home from school, with some people being trapped on the buses overnight or until very late at night. But that was not a school-wide problem, and that was, again, a massive outperformance. It was a big problem. We don't exactly know where the failure started. We think it was on the George Washington Bridge, coupled with an Amtrak failure that forced people on the roads. I'm not sure how many roads need to have closed, but from what I heard, it was a disaster, and it actually did lead to a fatality in the metro area itself. Alright, so enough beating around the bush. I do want to talk about disasters that might have actually caused the a virtual day to have been impossible, and I want to only look at metro area storms. So, well, yes, Ian probably led to a lot of people not being able to have school at all, as it devastated parts of west central Florida. Ian was also not exactly a problem up here, and we still had school as Ian battered the area. From what I heard, Ian did hit New Jersey pretty hard, but not New York. So, anyway, as far as some storms, Henri could have triggered closures. The thing with Hurricane Henri was that it struck in late August. Not only did it strike in late August, but it struck mainly on a Saturday into a Sunday, although impacts did linger into Monday across parts of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. But the bulk of the storm's activity was Saturday, Sunday. Saturday was when the system brought 4.45 inches of rain to the city, including 1.94 in a single night. This was heavy flash flooding, but again, it should have drained by Sunday. And Saturday night really was the worst of the rain, which was most of the impacts that Henri brought to the city. Henri was quite sparing in the fact that it did not cause a single death across the entire Northeast, though 2 people did die due to rip currents in North Carolina. However, there was $700 million in damage to be cleaned up in an area stretching from Delaware to Maine. And surprisingly, flooding in Delaware led to an injury and $16.1 million in damage, as parts of the state saw 9 inches of rain. The rain was heaviest in New York and New Jersey and points to the south. And the reason for that mainly was because of where the rain shield was in relation to the storm itself. But overall, the flooding was surprisingly not as big of a problem as what it was made out to be. Power outages. So, I'm sure that because a fifth of Rhode Island wound up losing power due to the storm, that they wouldn't have been able to hold virtual school if it occurred during the school year and on a weekday, because most of it was on the 22nd. Long Island was bracing for 600,000 power outages. Here's why. Isaias was a failure to the power grid, and it was so unpredicted that they really wanted to take these storms seriously. So they prepared that there was going to be 600,000 power outages. However, the island only saw 8,400 power outages, but the response times were extremely good because they prepared ahead of time. So because they were able to prepare ahead of time, the response was really good, especially compared to Isaias. Isaias fell on Tuesday, August 4th, so I don't think they would have canceled. So it was during the summer, and I don't think they would have canceled school because only 300,000 power outages were being predicted. Unfortunately, there were 420,000 power outages, and anyone, including me, who had enough extreme damage to have not gotten their power back by Friday morning would not, because a fire broke out at the power grid station on August 7th, 3 days after Isaias struck, leading to 50,000 power outages, and also leading to the entire power grid becoming destabilized. If they had worried about the Isaias outages first, which I still think they should have, from what I've heard, it could have actually led to the entire island's power grid being compromised, which would have led to a power crisis, similar to what happened in Texas, just 6 months later. I don't think Elsa would have triggered any cancellation because, well, first of all, it was on July 8th and 9th, Thursday and Friday, but it was, again, in July, the start of summer break. Also, the worst of Elsa's impacts came in at about 4 to 5 o'clock, and while, yes, it did lead to extreme problems for commuters across New York City, this would have been an after-school problem. It wouldn't have been a during-school problem. And this is in 2021, so I apologize for going forward in time when I'm supposed to be going back in time. But I do know of some storms that would have led to virtual schooling being impossible. I think the elephant in the room here is Hurricane Sandy. When Sandy bore down the shores on the 29th and 30th, so most schools canceled on the 29th just in case, because they didn't know when the storm was going to be. 3/4 of Long Island lost power, and power outages were even significant in New York City. I mean, about half the city lost power. Usually it's rare for the city to see extreme power outages because usually the lines are underground, but the storm surge was so high that power lines flooded and the response time was extremely poor. People were still without power in January. Honestly, in Isaias, if you got your power back 6 days after, you were very unlucky. But in Sandy, it was almost a good thing because it was so bad that they could not even start restoring energy until the 1st of November. They had to wait until the 1st of November because it wasn't safe to restore power until then. They had to do investigations to make sure that it was even safe to start restoring power. And that was why after Katrina, when almost all of New Orleans lost power, power did not begin to be restored for 2 weeks. It was like the New York City version of Katrina, or about as bad as a tropical cyclone in New York City could be. There could have been a worse tropical cyclone, but other factors made Sandy more prominent, like the lower pressure, the higher storm surge. Even if a Cat 3 or 2 struck New York City, or I should say Cat 2 or 3, even if a Cat 3 had struck New York City, I don't think it could have been quite as destructive as Sandy. Let's say that the Long Island Express took a more westerly track and more deeply affected New York City. I don't know if it would have been the same problem that Sandy was. Number one, of course, it was 1938. But number two, it's just that the storm wasn't as significant as Sandy. To me, the 1938 Long Island hurricane does seem like a worse storm than Sandy, but it's hard to give them a point-by-point comparison. I also think it was bad that Sandy struck 90 miles south west of New York City because it put New York City in the front quadrant. I think that had Sandy become struck directly in New York City, I don't think it would have been quite as bad. Just because then the worst of the shield would have struck other places. While Sandy was still fully tropical, Category 1 winds were felt across Long Island as well. Although there were no Category 1 winds in New Jersey or Delaware until the storm had already become extratropical, and that's also why the landfall did not count. As such, combined with Irene being downgraded in its New Jersey landfall, New Jersey's only still seen one hurricane landfall. 2 storms moved through the state at hurricane strength, Vagabond and the 1903 hurricane. Oh no, Vagabond was 1903, and the gale of 1878. And any October hurricane making landfall north of Florida, which hadn't happened since 1954, was delayed 4 more years until Matthew accomplished such a feat in 2016. So yeah, that was a bit of a painful nightmare. I think that Sandy would have led to a few days of school cancellations, but I think that by the start of November, it would have been safe enough. Having said that, most Halloween places couldn't even postpone, but had to outright cancel because of the storm. Halloween or Easter, that just caused a few postponations and not a lot of cancellations. Sandy had to postpone Sandy forced a lot of places to actually have to fully cancel, and the reason why they had to fully cancel after Sandy was simply because it wasn't going to be safe enough for a long time, which is again why the New York City Marathon in 2012 had to have been canceled. So I don't know what would have happened. A lot of the schools lost power. The generators failed for like one of the first times in history. We saw a lot of people who had generators still lose power. Sandy was a cataclysmic storm, and I think that Sandy is one of the few cases where school simply could not have gone on, even virtually, owing to the extreme impact of the storm. Here's the thing though, Sandy was about as worst case of a scenario as a storm could get. Sandy was the epitome of New York City storms. While I don't think it was the worst storm in New York State history, I still think that goes to the Long Island hurricane. It was probably one of the worst storms in New York City history. And a tropical cyclone. So the Great Blizzard of 1888, which caused 200 deaths, and was a big mess that led to the stock exchange being closed for 2 days. I don't think if it had struck today, it would have been as bad as it was. That being said, I don't know if they could have had virtual school. I definitely know that the city pretty much shut down as a result of the blizzard. And the blizzard and Sandy even compared because they were the only 2 storms that caused the stock exchange to shut down for 2 consecutive days. The Lindsay storm of 1969 was a day and a half, but it did reopen halfway through the second day of closure, so it was not a full 2 days. So you really see this 1888 blizzard and Sandy being compared as the worst storms in New York City history. So again, we saw that very destructive impact taking root of the city during, those 2 times. Were there other storms that would have caused this kind of cancellations? Probably. Gloria was a pretty nasty storm that caused over 50% of Long Island to lose power. And it struck as a Category 1 storm in an area somewhere between JFK and MacArthur. We don't know exactly where it struck, so we think it struck somewhere in Nassau County directly. Another storm that could have caused something was Irene, although probably not quite, and Irene also did strike again end of summer. But there aren't that many storms in New York City to make it where, storms can hit. And as much as I don't like New York City, and I do think that something that's a better weather, it's important to realize that we are rather fortunate in the sense that in some places, storms cause these things to happen where online school is impossible for much longer. Look at what Ian did to the Sarasota area, Florida, or what Ida did in New Orleans, or what Harvey did to Houston, Irma did to the entire western coast of Florida, what Maria did to devastate Puerto Rico. Maria is the reason why Fiona was so bad in Puerto Rico. Look at why, Michael was so bad across the Appalachian region. Look at why Florence was so bad across North Carolina. You can clearly see that those areas would probably not be able to have had even online school for a little bit, just because of the fact that the devastation brought on by these storms was just so great. So I do think that even if COVID happened and virtual schooling was the thing, I don't think that it would have been able to have happened during Sandy. But I do want to make this point where I'm not sure of any other storms this could have happened, and a Sandy-like storm in terms of impact striking the city would be very rare. Here's why. The Great Blizzard of 1888 was only so bad because of 1888, and with improved forecast modeling, the storm could not have been as bad. Keep in mind, too, that 1888 became the coldest March in New York City history. Temperatures during the storm fell as low as 6 degrees Fahrenheit, with a high of only 12. That was the coldest so late in the season, and in our era of climate change, practically impossible. The average March temperature of 30.0 degrees was also pretty impossible. Keep in mind that the blizzard started off as rain with temperatures in the 40s. But that was considered warm for such a brutal March. 1888 would go on to be the coldest year ever in New York City history. Coldest year ever in New York City history was realized in 1888. The average temperature that year was only 49.3 degrees. So 1888 would be the coldest spring in New York City. 1888 would just be a very cold year for the city in general. And that is why you need to understand that I don't think a storm could have dumped 21 inches of snow in March in this day and age. And I think that the better forecasting system would have led to fewer fatalities for sure. But I think that Sandy is a storm that, with climate change, is going to be very likely to get worse. We're going to see more storms be able to just batter the city like that. And eventually what we're going to see is that New York City can't be spared from Cat 3s forever. Eventually, New York City will see a high-end Cat 3, possibly bordering on Cat 4, probably sometime in the next 50 years. That will cause even more problems, likely leading to thousands of deaths, trillions in damages, power outages lasting for months, and a humanitarian crisis. New York City was pretty lucky that we avoided a humanitarian crisis during Sandy. It was really like Katrina and Maria that were the two storms to bring humanitarian crises to the United States. And while I'm pretty sure that there was a humanitarian crisis in the Winter Storm Uri Texas power crisis, that I'm not so sure of. If there's a humanitarian response to that. So these humanitarian disasters are really big problems, and it's just like what storms are going to happen. Tornadoes in New York City have never been stronger than EF2 status, so I do ponder what would happen if an EF3 or EF4 was able to strike the city. I don't think an EF5 tornado would be possible in our area, especially given how they would likely find a loophole as to why the tornado was an EF4, not an EF5, is what happened in Worcester, Massachusetts. But yeah, if a Worcester-like tornado happened here, it would be even worse. And we know how bad the Worcester tornado was. So, yeah.